Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. As your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, share this episode with your family and friends. And visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com. I have a great guest today. I have Michael Walsh, editor of Against the Corporate Media, 42 Ways the Press Hates You. Michael, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good, Nicholas. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, I'm glad I could have you on. You compiled a collection, a range of critical thinkers together, right? Charlie Kirk, Monica Crowley, Sebastian Gorka, and many, many others. And what common thread connects these contributors together? And what's the consequence of what they've wrote about, what they found in the media shift away from objectivity?
Well, I'll back up by saying that this is the second book in what we project to be a 3, 4, maybe more book series of against books.
Well,
so
the media gives you unending opportunities. So.
Oh, it does. Yeah, it was shooting fish in a barrel that in this case. But against the notion of being against something goes way back in history. It goes back to Cicero denouncing Mark Antony in the Philippics. It goes back to King Philip himself in Greece. It was used by Tertullian, one of the early Catholic Church fathers, against Marcion. So it's got a long distinguished intellectual history. So we did a book called Against the Great Reset, which was basically an anti-Klaus Schwab, WEF, their opportunistic plan to remake the world, as Bond villains always want to. Schwab's definitely a Bond villain. And so we had a big success with that book, and then this brought forth the second book. So what links all the writers is my Rolodex, basically. I've been in this business for 50 plus years now, so I know pretty much everybody in it, personally or by professional reputation. And so I just reached out and I thought up the topics we wanted to cover, the sections I was going to organize them in. So an organizational job, really. And then it was herding cats, of course, because writers, you know how much writers love to be marching along in a little military discipline. Anyway, we got it all together, and it's now out as of last week, and we're very pleased with it.
Well, it's a phenomenal book. And in the book, it argues that journalists today seem to have a higher duty to reject conservatism and essentially police speech, right? I mean, it comes down to they become an extension of government. How did this mindset take hold within the journalist community?
It started exactly a century ago with Walter Lippmann, who was a very important and influential columnist at the time. And his career went on in post-World War II. He wrote a book in 1922 called Public Opinion. And in that book, he said that the media's opinion needed to be formed for it, rather than letting the media come up with its own analysis of what was happening. So he was an early advocate of having the government manufacture popular opinion by telling the media what to do. Now, for a long time, there was resistance to that, and because the media was, a bunch of working class, Irish, Italian, Jewish kids who had come up from the streets, basically, if we're in New York, the streets. So they didn't have a college degree. They just wanted to work. And journalism didn't require any professional certification or background or college degree. You could just get a job as a reporter, and if you did well, you stayed, and if you didn't, you got fired. That held out for the longest time until Donald Trump. And then it was overthrown by the New York Times in a column by Jim Rutenberg during the 2016 campaign, where he basically said, if you like him, think that Trump is just beyond the pale, just a different kind of candidate, cannot be tolerated by any reasonable person, then you, as a journalist, have a duty not to treat him fairly, but to realize there's not two sides to every story, and his side is not worth reporting, except in an extremely negative way. And this is the first time a major journalistic outfit has come out and said that. And now they've all adopted it, of course. There's not even a mention of objectivity in the Society of Professional Journalists rulebook, handbook, anymore. They're gleeful propagandists for the regime. And like I said, it took a century, but Lippman finally won.
Yeah, and you could see it in the results. 95% of the coverage on Trump is negative, and 100% of the coverage on Kamala Harris is positive. But something that you said is even more important. You talked about the working class roots of journalists, that it didn't require college education. People from big cities to small rural towns came and they became journalists. And I want to talk to you about that shift when we get back from this quick break. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Michael, before the break, we were talking about the change in journalism, and it didn't require a college degree. Then, all of a sudden, they put in degree requirements, and you get these leftist indoctrination institutions that really there's no difference in the journalists that they're producing, right? They mostly come from the same backgrounds, middle to upper middle classes, same similar dynamics behind them. And do you think that's helped create this groupthink mentality amongst the press?
Yes, absolutely. They're a different social class now. They're the guys that went to Harvard. And if you've ever met anyone who went to Harvard, the first thing you know about him is he went to Harvard, because that's the first thing he's going to tell you. They are now, they're upper middle class or even well-off kids who can afford to go to an Ivy League school, or their Ivy League legacies at this point. They're not those street kids anymore. They have a much more conformist attitude towards political power than the have-nots who used to be journalists. So when I started, I got my first job on the payroll in February of 1972 at a newspaper called the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle in New York, upstate New York. I didn't know anybody I never even heard of journalism. I certainly didn't know anybody who had one. And when I came on the staff, the only question about that they asked me was, did I have a college degree in anything? Could have been animal husbandry. Well, it was just about as bad. It was classical music. So, and they said, great, you're a police reporter. So there I went from the refined world at the practice room down into the streets where the mafia guys were blowing each other in half with shotguns. And it was a whole new education for me. And it made me into a good reporter. You learn how to write fast, on deadline, accurately, under tremendous pressure. It's the middle of the night. The newsrooms in those days were chaotic. The shouting and noise of teletype machines and typewriters, and the editor's queries, the cries for copy, which meant copy boy. And that, in fact, had just changed, because it used to be boy. And this was now 1972, and boy took on a racial aura to it, even though there were no blacks in the newsroom in 1972, or very few. But it got changed to copy. Anyway, you'd be hearing them yelling, copying, and all this stuff. So you had to learn how to write it under combat conditions, and sometimes literally under combat conditions. Later on in my journalistic life, I was in Eastern Europe. I'm actually talking to you from Berlin right now, so it's kind of my old hometown. I was here when the wall came down in 1989. I knew the city very well, mostly on the east side, where I had gone through Checkpoint Charlie for the first time in 1985. And I was in the Soviet Union when Chernobyl blew up. And then, in fact, I left Moscow 2 weeks before the coup against Gorbachev. So writing under those conditions was sometimes difficult, just getting your story transmitted. We didn't have the kind of technological advances that I'm using to talk to you right now. Sometimes you had to type it out on a teletype machine, but you did what you took to get the story. And there was no sort of defeat whining about how difficult or stressful the job was. That's all changed. Now it's difficult and stressful and whiny and propagandistic.
That's for sure. And I could easily argue that the corporate media, they no longer serve the interests of the people. They don't serve as the fourth estate anymore. They're not the watchdogs of power, but they become an extension of the Democratic Party. Would that be a fair assessment? And what does that mean for our politics going forward?
Well, it's definitely a fair assessment. Now, from my point of view, and from the conservative writers that I enlisted in this cause, you'll get an argument about it. Some of my colleagues from the years I was at Time Magazine, which was between 1981 and 1997, have actually come out and said, there aren't two sides to every story. There's only one side, and responsible journalists should only cover one side. That would be the late Joe Biden, may he rest in peace, and Kamala Harris side of it. I'm so old that I still believe that there are two sides to the story, and that's your job, not deciding that there aren't two sides to the story. So this is where we're at right now, and they become propagandistic. They've become court eunuchs. And there's a lot of terms to describe them: stenographers, court stenographers. They do speak with a kind of unanimous voice, which is hilarious. Like when they decided that Kamala's campaign would be about joy, suddenly everybody had the word joy in the headline. So, as I had mentioned, I spent a lot of time in the German Democratic Republic and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and I've seen what top-down journalism looks like, and it looks exactly like what you're seeing right now.
Yeah, and there's no doubt it's state-sponsored journalism, and it's funny because you bring up the whole idea of joy. Every single time something goes on, it's like they all get the same exact script, almost word for word, that they put out there. But this is a threat. I mean, let's be honest. You have
Yeah.
colleges and higher education institutions. So the University of Wisconsin and a few others received a $5 million government grant from the feds to develop something called Course Correct that will go in newsrooms to correct what they deem as misinformation. When it comes to the media and how they become an extension of government, what's the threat? What's the impact on censorship and freedom of speech? And how does this fit into this globalist agenda that we're seeing?
Well, it's sad but true that the decline of journalism coincides with the unanimity of journalism. So they're in the position now of going out of business, a lot of them, a lot of newspapers. And then they go to the government and say, we need money to stay as independent journalists. The contradiction inherent in that statement seems to elude them. But this is what you get. So you get these grants to fight misinformation and disinformation. We had that awful Disinformation Bureau proposed and briefly established in this country, run by some termagant named Dina Jankowicz, who you just knew was going to be trouble. And luckily, there was enough of a pushback, but they'll try it again. There will be a state ministry of information if they have their way. And that's why it's so important that there are two sides of the story. Otherwise, you feel like you're living in a futuristic science fiction movie like Planet of the Apes, where, the apes have taken over the journalistic establishment and are now dictating to the human slaves. It's sad. It's sad, but it's not unexpected. Once the social gap was bridged, once they no longer needed street kids with high school diplomas, maybe, if that, but they began to self-select from their own Ivy League legacy status, the course was set then for unanimity of opinion, because they all, as I pointed out many times, they marry each other, they have affairs with each other, the journalists sleep with the politicians, and the politicians sleep with the journalists, and the journalists become politicians, and then they go back to being journalists and pretend to be unbiased observers of the journalistic process while waiting for the next turn of events where they can go back to Washington and take over a bureau again. They found that was a short route to power, and they've taken it. So they've done so within a Faustian bargain, but it's bad for America because there's only one side to the story now. So Against the Corporate Media is meant to show you how many ways they're malfeasant. One of my favorite sections was the media versus America, where I have 10 essays by people telling us what the media doesn't know anything about, like Kurt Schlichter on the military. They don't know anything about the military. I grew up in the Marine Corps. Liz Sheld on firearms. The media never shot a gun in its life and would be scared of it if they just saw one. Jack Dunphy, a pseudonym for a retired LA police detective, on what the journalists don't know about cops. Used to be journalists and cops were kind of natural allies. They were often on the same story, cops and firemen. They were wanted to get at what happened and get a narrative of who got killed and why. Now, of course, they're the antithesis of each other. And the journalists were right out there, with the defund the police nonsense after the George Floyd riots. So you see the change has been made, but the American public is left really in the dark about all these very important things. And the journalists have nobody to thank but themselves.
It is a sad state of affairs, and it's disgusting watching the journalists of today and the media and the way they behave. They really have done enormous damage to the institution of journalism. But there may be some good news coming out of this, and I want to talk to you about that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Michael, we're talking about how the state of journalism is abysmal in this day and age. But there is a positive that may have come out of this, and that's the rise of independent journalists. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I started with Andrew Breitbart in 2010. Andrew met me at a party in LA and kind of impulsively said, "Hey, you've got to be the editor of one of my new sites." They were called the big sites: big journalism, big Hollywood, big peace, big government. So I said, okay. And then we got that site up and running in 2010. And that was Breitbart's idea, that there'd be citizen journalists. It's something he and I argued about, because I think you can have citizen journalists, but I'd rather they know what they're doing. That is, how do you smell a bogus story? How do you know when someone's lying to you? All these things, these tools you learn as a reporter. If you're just a citizen journalist, you might get manipulated. Or you may not write the story very well because you're not a good writer. There's lots of qualifications of journalists that were quite necessary and quite good, and the best of them rose rapidly through the ranks and went on to become, in my case, novelists, best-selling authors, Hollywood screenwriter. I've done all of that thanks to starting in journalism. That gave me the best education that you could possibly have. But I do think some of the techniques are needed. Anyway, Breitbart changed the whole equation briefly. And then he died just about a year or two later. And the empire, sort of like Alexander's, turned into something different. And right now, I don't know whether citizen journalism is the way forward or not. You can't believe anything you read or even see anymore. AI will be just the death of everything, because you can fake every single thing. And then we'll be in this world completely atomized. We might as well be living in caves, because you won't be able to trust anything. But the journalists have themselves to thank for that too. And Harvard, of course, they have to always thank Harvard for how brilliant and wonderful they are.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point that you're bringing up. It's so difficult for ordinary Americans who are busy with their everyday lives, either going to school, going to work, raising families, to try and sit there and distinguish what's true and what's not. So, the move by journalism to go to just become an extension of government has done an enormous amount of damage. Now, you have a long, illustrious career in journalism. The very nature of it, aren't you supposed to be skeptical of government?
Well, I used to say that to young journalists. I'd write one word on the blackboard: skepticism. That's the most important quality you can possibly have. Today's young kids think that's rude. They're not used to someone saying, "Well, here's what I think," blah blah, and the other guy says, "Yeah, well, that's complete crap," right? Because now they're offended that you've attacked their opinion. It's very important to be skeptical of everything. The old saying in journalism was, if your mother tells you she loves you, get a second opinion, because you can't trust anybody. But again, this is now faded away in this conformist background. Journalism became feminized during the 70s and 80s, and now it's almost wholly a feminine occupation. If you look at, especially on television, on the cable shows, it's mostly women talking to each other. And women and men think differently. I said it. And they react differently, and they have different emotions, play a different role in their lives. And I think what we've gotten, in addition to conformist journalism, is feminized journalism and safety journalism and how dare you say that journalism and my feelings are hurt journalism. And you see where I'm going with this. I'm already in enough trouble as it is. But that's what has happened.
Yeah, it's it. I mean, I teach my students like always be skeptical of government. I mean, when we talk about misinformation and disinformation, governments throughout history, not just the United States, but throughout history, have been the largest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
they have to be. They have to be. They
why
can't
is
tell the
that?
people. Well, why? Because they live in the real world. There are some things that you don't want to tell people. There are some things you cannot tell people. There are some things that knowing of it is worse than the not knowing of it. Very few. I mean, this doesn't excuse wholesale censorship and classification of literally everything, which is what now happens in government. So you have to pick and choose your lies. That's the point. But Michael Crichton, the late Michael Crichton, talked about something called the Gell-man effect, which is that for an ordinary journalist consumer, I hate that word, but that's what they use. If he or she reads a story or sees a story about something they personally know very well, they realize the story is crap, that the journalist has got it completely wrong, sometimes completely backwards, and has reversed, as Crichton pointed out, cause and effect. And Crichton called that the wet streets cause rain reaction to something. Um, that Gelman effect then posits that everything else you read, you think it must be true. And yet the one thing you actually know something about, isn't. So what does that tell you about the whole nature of the journalistic enterprise? For example, I pointed out in my essay, which opens the book, that Pheidippides ran the first marathon and got back to the Athenians and said victory and died. Okay. Well, I don't know. Was it a victory? They have no way of independently proving until days when they get to the battlefield or whatever later. They had to trust Pheidippides. And in this case, he was right. They'd won that battle. But you read, as we know, the first reports of anything now are probably wrong. So don't form your opinion from the instant reaction that you get from the journal. And this has been true of journalism for a long time. Wait a while before you find out. For example, I'm here in Europe now, and I went to bed the other night hearing there was a gunman at Trump's golf course. And then that story became two gunmen firing at each other. And I went to bed and said, "Oh, I wonder what that's all about." Then the next morning, I learned that it was actually an assassination attempt by one gunman who didn't fire at anybody. So that's an example of getting it wrong from the start. We used to always say in journalism, you want to be first and you want to be right. Now, those two things conflict with each other often, almost always. So, on which side do you err, right? First
Especially in the
or
day and
right?
age of social media.
Well, yeah, today anybody can write anything on social media and it's immediately available to people. So you've got to, I would say, be right better than being first. But it's hard. Journalism isn't as easy as it looks. Reporting, I prefer to call it, but it requires an open mind. What am I looking at? Leave your prejudices at the door. Your prejudices in every sense of why you think this happened and what your first instincts tell you. And I would say, think like a cop. I mean, as a novelist, I do that too. If I'm writing about, or even as a nonfiction writer, when I'm writing about people, I dig into their background, leave long dead people till I understand who this person is. And that's a policeman looking for the perp, right? As you go back in time. And I think that that's a very important skill. Now it's just, well, this is my opinion. Here it is. And then let the chips fall where they may. This isn't going to end well, Nicholas.
Well, now one final question on that. Do you think that there's going to be an epiphany inside the media? They're going to see the error of their ways and reform, or do you think it's only
No.
going to get worse?
Surely you jest, right? Why would they reform? I mean, they're shedding jobs at an enormous rate. But right now, there's only one important job in journalism: White House correspondent. That's it. That's it. You used to work your way up through the sewer district hearing in your little, nowhere's town in Iowa, and then you went to the cop shop, and then you maybe covered the state legislature, and you worked your way up with the goal of getting to the big show, which was either in New York or Washington. Now, literal 16-year-olds are on Twitter opining about the election. Uh, so what does that tell you? It tells you it really is idiocracy. I had to go back and watch that movie the other day just because I had forgotten, especially the first part of it, how funny it is. It really is a kind of idiocracy in which everyone's opinion is given the same value, therefore has no value whatsoever.
Crazy times we're in, Michael. I really appreciate you coming on. Everyone needs to check out Against the Corporate Media, 42 Ways the Press Hates You. Thanks for coming on, Michael.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at pasreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.